for this Catalysing Change webinar on client-driven evaluation. And I'm hopeful that there'll be a few others joining us, some of the stragglers caught in traffic. And so good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you all. This is the second webinar on this topic. And I'll share with you first just the agenda of this call. I should have had it properly up. That we will just introduce Catalyst to any for whom that are not familiar with Catalyst. And then we'll proceed really with a deep dive into this topic of client-driven evaluation. And I'll take you to the summary of the proposal that we have on this topic, developed as a result of the first webinar. And Selina Serna will give us a summary of the discussion so far. We'll then break up into groups and have a deeper dive into the discussion, and then look at client-driven evaluation as part of systemic engagement. That is very much what Catalyst 2030 is all about. And then again, we'll have hopefully a second round of breakups and look at the very concrete next steps. Yvonne, can I turn over to you first to just say a few words about Catalyst 2030, please?
Yes, hello everyone. Welcome to this webinar on client-driven evaluation. I'm just going to quickly just share a bit about Catalyst 2030 for those of you who might not be so familiar with it. Catalyst 2030 is a network of social entrepreneurs, funders, and other social change innovators who believe in collective actions and new strategies that are needed to achieve the SDG goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, by 2030. It's supported by Ashoka, Echoing Green, Schwab, and Skoll, and it has been initiated by leading social entrepreneurs from all these networks. The group is inclusive and rapidly expanding to include governments, funders, bilateral organizations, and multilateral organizations. And after the outbreak of COVID-19, we decided to set up a campaign called Catalysing Change to conceptualize by members from across the network to surface issues such as sharing their COVID-19 response, forming collaborative partnerships, co-creating on policy recommendation and scalable solutions, and initiating a dialogues with policymakers. So this is this is a 4-round campaign. This is the third round of the campaign, which is mainly focusing on consolidating recommendations. The second round of the campaign, we initiated these roundtable discussions where people have been deep diving into issue-based policy, and the whole idea is for these roundtables to come up with a policy recommendation and shovel-ready solutions that will be shared into a large document and report eventually, which will be shared with, for the last round, handed over to key political stakeholders, such as the UN Deputy Secretary General and other heads of state and concerned persons that should be involved in this. So this is just a bit of an introduction to Catalyst and what we're actually doing. And if anyone is interested, they can reach out to me directly. I will put my email down in the chat, and then you feel free to reach out to me if you're interested to learn more. Yeah, thank you.
Yvonne, thank you so much. Yeah, wonderful to see a number of you joining this call. Really thrilled about that. So why this topic of client-driven evaluation? It was a topic first put to us in terms of client-centered evaluation, but that is in a sense so basic and it's almost vanilla to propose that, because on paper everyone says that they're client-centered. And then what we discussed there was, well, what is the nuance here? What is it that we're talking about that is in some ways different? And reflecting on the experience of some of us, was really that question of client-driven evaluation that would add something new. And why is that needed at all? Well, first of all, in terms of achieving the SDGs, capturing the right metrics is clearly of enormous importance. But we also know that lasting change and resilient change only ever occurs if people own it, if they're truly part of the process. And it begs then the question of, well, why shouldn't they also be part of the evaluation? In fact, why shouldn't they be driving the evaluation? And why can't we then derive metrics from below? So I'll just share with you where we have landed with the challenge that was put to us and that Yvonne summarized beautifully in terms of these ready-made proposals. And so what we have, and I've shared in the chat to you all, the 2-page document, but here is simply the summary of it. And I will move around our pictures just a little bit to make space for reading it. Is that clients must have the opportunity to co-create the standards and metrics against which the success of a project meant to improve their lives is going to be assessed. Clients must have free, open, and easy access to all key documents about a project that is meant to benefit them. This can include, but is not limited to, budgets, contracts, project documents. Necessary information must be accessible in their own language, right? Doesn't help if it's in English if no one reads that. Clients should have free, open, and easy access to tools that enable them to assess and report on the extent to which they're receiving what they were meant to receive. And clients should be able to secure redress when these commitments are not met. Now, in some ways, this is aligned with so many principles that have been endorsed and adopted and propagated in recent years on access to information, on transparency in aid, on open government, on open contracting, on the core humanitarian standards, which talk about putting communities and people at the center. It's entirely consistent with all of that, except for the fact that these principles, as identified here, don't exist in the international policy discussions. So it's really, you could say it's such a slim distinction and addition that we're providing, and yet it simply isn't there, right? And so this is where we are landed at so far in this draft. And Selina, if you could now speak, please, to what have the discussions been until now? Please unmute yourself. Yeah, thanks.
Hi. Yep. Hello, everyone. Some very interesting conversation that's come out of review of this first 2-page draft. And I think at the heart of it is that we want to be true system. I'm going to read someone's words because they're way better than mine. If we want to be true collaborative system changers, we need to place our clients and their needs first. Our role is that of an honest broker who listens, tries to understand, learns, shares, and co-creates based on the client's needs. The discussion points that flowed from there are that we should not overburden the client with data gathering, that the only reason we collect data is to prove the impact, but we're destroying it in this way. We want to share experiences and failures and learn in a peer-to-peer fashion. We collaborate with academics to do deep dive academic research to show the evidence of impact that can be generalized. The initiatives should be designed with the client guiding the process and involved in developing the model continuously through constant feedback from the ground. That we as social entrepreneurs should bust existing silos of interventions and mindsets, that we should co-create with them, with colleagues and the resource brokers, such as governments and donors, placing the client's needs first. That we collaborate based on our areas of expertise, but we let go of our pet projects and issues and shape interventions that are based on client needs. we utilize resources that map the interconnections between SDGs and look at the interactions in the various goals and targets, determining to what extent they reinforce or conflict with each other. That we map the SDGs with each member in each group, that each member in each group is working on to see the full ecosystem within the movement. And we highlight where organizations can collaborate to broaden their collective focus of impact. And we focus on doing rather than advocacy to show the power of that collaboration in a way that will encourage adoption of these methods. That was the highlight.
Thank you so much, Selina. Really appreciate that. So what we're now going to do is to break up into groups first, and then we will have a bit of commentary from someone I invited in, Arthur Wood, who is one of the fathers of the impact investing in several forms in terms of the development of the first social impact bond and blended value products. So he will come in afterwards. But if you please, Yvonne, could break us up into small groups. And if we could then just give us, have a chance to discuss this and your thoughts on this draft. You have access to the 2-pager, or it's a bit more than 2 pages, in the chat, and the feedback that Selina shared that we've had so far.
Yeah, should I just go ahead?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Welcome back, and lovely to see a friend or two on the call. Are there any highlights that anyone wants to share from this first round of discussions? Anything that particularly struck you or inspired you or challenged you? Shona.
Yeah, I could just say that, again, the same topic keeps coming up, is how do we report and understand and influence impact in one way only, and that is from the people we work with through to the funders in one smooth action and not 2 lots of impact reporting. So how do we really understand and react to what's needed, but also use that same way of working to report to the funders?
Mm-hmm. Anyone else? So I'll invite you, Arthur, to come in and share a few thoughts, from the perspective that you have on impact from a finance point of view, on impact investing.
Thank you very much, Frederick. I guess I've come to this problem from the opposite end to where the vast majority of you have come from. I did work, and part of the reason I know Ashoka is, Frederick, I was a leadership group member of Ashoka with the brief, how do you change the way that philanthropy is funded? And metrics and measurement are absolutely fundamental to any banking relationship. And it strikes me that, well, the first point I'd make is that if we look at this within the context of just government and foundations, then let's not talk about the SDGs, because the reality of the SDGs is we are $2.5 trillion to $4 trillion short per annum. And there's roughly $350 billion worth of total, what could we call strategic subsidy. So we can look within our individual silos and we can talk about creating systems change within our silos and funding that through foundations, and that's fine. But if we actually have a vision that we want to solve the SDGs, then we have to say we're going to engage the mainstream commercial and capital markets. And if you want to do that, then there are three key tools. And the first key tool is it. And it's true of when you look at Facebook, and it's true how Google, and it's the same as Mr. Trump and potentially the Russians. If you look how data is used in that environment, it has a number of aspects. One critical aspect is in our sector, the people that pay are not the same people that consume. If you've got a cup of coffee and you don't like it, you walk with your feet. Our beneficiaries and consumers, for the most part, can't do that. And there is a process, which we all know occurs, whereby funders, organizations put in pitches, and it's to the benefit of the larger organizations, not the smaller ones. And they say they've done a good job. The institution has a vested interest in saying they've done a good job because they're a blue chip brand. And irrespective of whether it's good, bad, or indifferent, the cycle continues. So the first critical bit is obviously everything we should do should be rooted in the community itself. The second aspect to that is the moment you do that, and that's what technology provides us to do, and a number of you have those sort of systems, that data becomes a real-time management tool. We don't produce reports for 3 or 4 or 6 months later to justify a funding grant. But in this case, it actually becomes a management tool. You can manage a process dynamically as a function of that feedback. Secondly, if you tie it into finance, then what happens in every other sector of the economy is that that information prices the outcome that you wish to see. This is the reason that people that work in the City of London and Wall Street get paid more than journalists. They understand the time value of that money. 2 days later, you get paid as a journalist. You get it within 30 seconds. You understand the time value of your money. So the critical bit from a finance perspective is potentially then thinking how that information, ergo what your consumer and your market is doing, is priced into potentially a security. If you were to do that and you were to give ownership to the respective stakeholders, then that ensures you're beginning to align incentives from your various stakeholders, including critically the community itself. The second bit is saying what metrics mechanism unites us rather than divides us. What gets measured is what gets done. And at the moment, because we're all funded in our silos, as opposed to looking from the community itself, we're funded in our silos, we have to justify funding in our silos. Those silos are often opaque, and even if I dare say it, they're often sometimes corrupt as well in the scheme of things. Now, if one was to actually say, what is the element that looks at the total value and captures that total value, and we measure the progress and the rate to that, then you begin to create a metrics mechanism that moves to everybody's advantage and is an incentive to collaborate and work together. And finally, you would want to make a mechanism that's competitive and comparative. Now, to a banker, that's 3 very simple things. It's the feedback loop, which is the Reuters of the system. It is having a metrics mechanism that unites rather than divides us. And it's actually then creating a mechanism that is competitive, comparative, and predictive. That's what Facebook is about. That's what Google is about. That's what the rest of the economy is about. It's not what development is about. But that is the opportunity of technology, and that is the opportunity of metrics. But the first critical building block is linking what we do to the community. At the moment, we work within a water and sanitation community, or a human rights community, or an education community. There is one community on the ground. It is the people we serve, and it is their voices that we should be listening to. Those are my only comments, Frederick.
Yes. No. No one can speak to this like you do, Arthur. It's a lot to take in, and it's a very different perspective than we would otherwise have had on this call. Does anyone have any questions or comments to Arthur first before we move on? Because this is a lot to take in. But there is this phenomenal gap in financing to really make sustainable development happen, or certainly the SDGs happen, and even in terms of climate change. We're nowhere near that. We need a radically different approach to this. But the quality of data is, as Arthur puts it, going to be one of the key determining factors, and the extent to which it's anchored in the community. Any questions or comments to this point?
I
I actually have a comment.
Hadil, please, and then Selina. You're still on mute. You're on mute.
I have a comment about how the world of data works. In theory, what I heard, it makes sense, but it makes sense in an ideal world where actually there is no power dynamics and there is no one controlling the data, and that the power, like what we call it, an even field, which is not the case in the case of data management. We know that data is the new oil, and it's being as extractive as oil has been. It's controlled and manipulated by different ways and means, and therefore, how can we assume that it's going to serve the messy business of development, which is not linear? It's very comprehensive, and it has many intersectionalities and many different kinds of risks and benefits, and power dynamics are basically not even. Usually it's not in favor of the people who we say we want to consult and we want to include. So basically, I don't see this working in a messy world without a real shift in the power dynamics and a real shift in who owns, who knows, and who can influence the desired results. In this case, SDGs or others. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Hadil, and thank you for being here. Selina.
I have a question for Arthur on what you see the capital markets expecting by way of return if they invest in water and sanitation, for example, and how do you bridge that that expectation of return?
Okay, let me take both those questions. Hadil's first, if I may. What you have referred to, Hadil, is absolutely critical, which is the governance structure and who owns that data and what is the mechanism behind that. That's already happening in the finance world. I don't want to discuss it here, but in terms of what the bankers have already put together, we are talking about individual innovation, but what they're structuring is a framework whereby the margin will be made on the distribution of the financial product. So you have to look at the whole chain. So you're right, we work in highly fragmented markets. What we need to do is to create a data frame that is competitive, comparative, and predictive. And that will come, the more feeds you create from the community over time, that will happen. And if you take a look at the Social Progress Index, who are 56 databases, and it's open architecture, you plug some more in. I've heard of 2 more brilliant ones today. What technology is doing 2 things. It is giving you the increasing capability of managing complexity. Take a look at CERN, for example, identifying the granularity of extremely short particles in incredibly complex environments. And the second thing it's doing is giving you the ability to track that granularity. So what technology is doing, and so what's happening, if you take a look at the Social Progress Index, which is a competitive and comparative framework, all the way down to potentially COVID, for example, when linked to what Frederick is proposing, then you can create, based on it, in down to the level of Indian cities, for example, something that is competitive, comparative, and predictive. So you're creating, you're not measuring in an absolute, you're measuring it in a framework that is competitive, comparative, and predictive. So what you're measuring, and this is the reason the community is critical, that you're creating the feedback directly from the community and then comparing it to the series of interventions that you inject. Now, you ask me, does that work? Well, go and read the US Senate intelligence report, and you'll see that's exactly what happened in the American elections, to give you one example. If you look at the work of Cambridge Analytica, that's what Cambridge Analytica has been working on in terms of manipulating elections in the developing world for a long time. So these are not new technologies and new processes. It's just that we don't, in development, we don't use them. And I would put it to you that our marketplace is certainly not necessarily less complex than, say, particle physics in the scheme of things. But so let me come back. I think this is doable, and I think a lot of the technology has been built. You have to lock into that a metrics mechanism, again, that unites us, not divides us. So to take your question, Selina, at the moment, we fund individual innovation. And the fundamental problem we have is that everything we wish to fund is less than $100 million. And you do not engage the capital markets unless you get to $100 million plus and a replicability. So what that calls for is to do what we all claim we want to do, is to collaborate and work together so that we can provide a larger economy of scale and larger degrees of collaboration. Our value working together, I think, Frederick, you've got a great slide on water and sanitation. Our value in working together is much higher than the sum of the totality is less than the individual parts. So if you can actually create a mechanism which allows you to marry the various innovations, you can create a framework. And this is what the rest of the economies have done with new technology. It allows you to leverage that innovation. So as opposed to trying to build the whole value chain yourself, which is what happens at the moment, you can create a mechanism. If you can track the innovation, you can pay it. So somebody can take the innovation that somebody else has developed, even in another sector, and use it. It's saving cost on one side and leveraging social and economic impact the other. One value. Second value is that if you aggregate a range of tools together, of those tools, you can bring in a range of other tools that are completely uneconomic. For example, risk management, insurance, blended value. Everything in finance is a function of scale. We end up talking about venture capital models because we only raise 1 million, 5 million. To do commercially a blended value model, you need 30 million. To get to insurance products and other capital market tools, you need 50 million. To liberate the $2 trillion worth of local pension funds in local South capital markets, you need an entity that is capitalized at about 500 million. Everything is issue of scale. And then the final point,
yeah, okay, you just wrap it up. Yeah.
And then the final value is actually what we talk about. In water and sanitation, the cost to the economy is $500 billion annually. It's all logged by JMP. So the opportunity is actually in solving the problem. That is where the value. Look at it as future cash flows lost.
Thanks, Arthur. Shauna, please.
I'm trying to understand how that shifts the power, Arthur.
Yeah. No, that doesn't.
Because
yeah.
Yeah, because if you're looking at data collected, being made available to the people who generate the data, and in so doing, creating movements of change from the first mile out instead of top down. I don't understand how that fits.
So, Arthur, no, I'll just introduce this next frame, and then I'll bring you in later on,
Okay.
Sean, because this is a wonderful set of issues that has been raised and leads perfectly to the next part of the discussion here. So in the next two parts here, what I'm going to show you, and some of you have seen this already, so apologies to those of you who have, is this frame that we're in the midst of discussing. Oops, but for some reason it's misbehaving, in Catalyst 2030 on a systemic engagement. But the reason for addressing the power dynamics, Hadil, is really at the core of this concept of client-driven evaluation, right? And so that is what I think unites us very clearly, is if we are serious about a client-centered approach, a people-centered approach, then client-driven evaluation, of course, has to be part of it. And if we're serious about dealing with the power dynamics as well. So I'll just share with you a few thoughts that we are working with in Catalyst 2030. The first is this notion that to address complex problems requires systems change. And with this little case study here of trying to protect a high value conservation area and address and achieve certain goals, we're finding that it's easily undermined by poverty in the community, lo and behold. Because when people are poor, they need to cut down the forest, and sometimes they kill some animals they're not supposed to. And providing them with alternative livelihoods is not that easy. And then some companies get illegal logging licenses or mining licenses. And then the forest protections look great on paper, but they're not being enforced. And finally, there's market demand for the natural resources coming out of that forest. No impact investor is able to control for all those things. No philanthropist is able to address all those things, right? And because of those systemic problems, we have to find ways of addressing these issues far more systemically than is the case at the moment. And part of the issue is here on the other slide, or on the other side, is the size of these investments, which doesn't allow us to build the infrastructure that's needed. But it's simply fundamentally because the investment model is a VC model, venture capital model, focusing on scaling a successful innovation. And no innovator is able to deal with all of those issues. The second slide is about how this creates opportunities, and this is what Arthur talked about, is if you invest in water and sanitation, this should have an improvement on health, especially in a country where there's no good water, clean water and sanitation. That should have an impact on education. If it has an impact on education, girls will do better. And if girls do better, this is the best predictor of poverty alleviation. In the current investment model, if you invest in water and sanitation, you get none of the gains from the positive externalities generated along the way. That's the nature of externalities. You neither pay for the negative externalities, nor do you gain from the positive. What if there was a way of capturing this? And the only way of doing that, one of the ingredients, not the only way, but one of the fundamental building blocks is, as Arthur said, is that there's only one community. And that people on the ground, the community itself, the clients, have to be drivers and owners of the process. One of the ways they are this is for them to produce the data. Now, I was challenged when I presented this to say, but is this really putting the community and people at the center, right? And if we look at the SDGs, that's not how people experience the SDGs. They don't experience the SDGs. The SDGs mean very little to people in their daily life. What matters to them is what they live and experience. And that is something the Social Progress Index tries to capture. But at the local level, these may be among the issues that people prioritize. And what we're exploring in Catalyst 2030 is the importance of doing both of those things, both a people and community-centered approach and a systemic approach, right? The systemic approach helping us to capture some of the overarching factors, and the people-centered approach obviously being fundamental. The risk of doing one is that you miss out on the perspective of the other. Finally, in the context of COVID, right? In the context of COVID, using again this graph, we find that there are certain issues and themes that come up in the countries that are doing very badly in terms of the response and recovery of COVID. There are health systems that are finding it very difficult to cope. Some people simply have far higher risks. It's an economic disaster for some. Information plays a key role right from the ground to policymakers. And then medium longer term, there are structural inequalities. Again, no social entrepreneur covers all of these points, right? So we need to collaborate to address any of these systemic issues. But the current financing models certainly don't allow that to be captured, but also the data models, of course, don't allow these systemic interventions to be captured. And again, simply there's only one community, right? So to the extent we are really community-centered, we are really enabling this power dynamic to shift. The question is, how can we generate this data from below? Any thoughts, comments, questions to this? So this is not a client-driven evaluation in a vacuum. It's not client-driven evaluation simply because we think it's a good idea and important, but because we think it's the only way to drive systems change. Any thoughts and comments? You're all convinced. Please
I have one thought.
Yes,
I have one
please.
question, and this is something that I just feel like is worth discussing because it's the biggest. I don't know if it's the biggest, but when Arthur's talking about trillions of dollars that we're short, and just the quantity of dollars that need to go into projects to achieve a certain kind of impact, there's a big disconnect between how much money you can even possibly spend effectively without getting into negative externalities in these projects. And so that's one of the innovations that I see, and one of the problems that the structural problems that needs to be solved is how to scale these small projects into larger collections of small projects that can effectively absorb larger quantities of investment dollars without going off the rails and having all these other unanticipated issues because you're trying to squeeze a large amount of money down a small pipe that can't take it. And you know, you look historically at international aid, and it's a lot of its failures. It's top down. It's, you know, historically, you know, this whole client-driven evaluation approach is trying to fix a lot of those errors and how to spend that money and how to impact change. But one of the big lessons is that when you try to spend money without it being centered on the actual needs of a community and starting from the bottom up, a lot of it gets lost. And you have a lot of, you know, you look back and studies have been done that show that the countries that have gotten the most international aid over the last 50 years are worse off, have worse democracies, more corruption. Every single metric that you're trying to change is worse because they couldn't absorb that quantity of money that was available even. And now, you know, and then to look at how we're short trillions of dollars to change these problems, you know, how do we not repeat that mistake? And how do you scale these small projects into big collections of small projects? Yes, I would love, and so I'm done. That's my question, is how do we do it
That's
effectively?
a great question. It's a fabulous question. Zenda, please.
Just, I do agree with Tab that that's truly very crucial. I find there's much to say, but the only thought I want to leave in addition to what Tab had said is there have been experimentation with systems approaches in different ways. Probably one of the best known ones is the Millennium Villages project of Sachs and people who have been that have been completed a while ago. Have any of you worked with that, or do you know that model?
Not in any depth, personally. No, I know.
Yes, so I was just, and I don't want to belabor it, but basically they took a fairly large number of villages and used an integrated systems approach, although not a perfect one. Not, you know, today we know more about how to do it, but they did try to develop, for example, the health systems, the education systems, economic income, and so on, in a place-based focus, number of communities. To try to see if such an integrated approach, connecting also to the outside world, not just internally, can make a real difference. And evaluations were done. It was highly controversial, primarily because economists generally do not understand systems work, I think, and so they didn't really accept what was being done. And the evaluations were not structured with randomized control trials and all of the stuff that economists want. However, there was evidence that if you look at the high-level indicators that were measured, and they were measured top-down, not so much bottom-up, that there was improvement across, I think, 30 of the 40 things that they measured. And they spent $120 per person per year. If you think about it, that is, it sounded like a lot of money that went into that project. I think it ran for 12 years. It's a lot of money that was absorbed compared to the normal size of projects. Not to belabor it, one can look at that as one approach that can be improved upon, but the basis of it was a place-based approach where many different agencies and service providers and so on could work together. But then also thinking about the size of slice of money, when you think that it's $120 per person per year, it's not really much in any country. Although it is much compared to the $1 or $2 that many donors do spend per place, and then say that they do provide a lot of aid. You know, when you really study it, it is so dispersed that it's actually meaningless, and actually sometimes amazing that something is being achieved. As an evaluator, I just want to add one more thing: the externalities, both positive and negative, the unintended consequences of what is being done is extremely important. And my concern with any so-called measurement framework, it has to capture those, and it has to capture patterns that arise, not just high-level indicators, because that is where things can be caught in adaptive management style or adaptive learning style that can enable things to go off the rails. And one can catch it early and understand much more of what's going on. So any systems, whether it's bottom up or top down, need to also be aware of the externalities, both positive and negative.
And this point about the unintended consequences is vital. Yes, for sure. Yeah, thank you. Any other feedback and comments on this? Yes, Sadia.
I want to go back to the issue of power and power dynamics, because what happened with the American elections, or examples that were given, are exactly about this. So thinking of a system change that is client driven already assumes some kind of dynamics, some kind of power structures. And looking at it as an evaluation approach only, without actually being part of a comprehensive system, from the design to implementation to evaluation and to the feedback loops, is, I don't know, it's for me still not clear, a little bit problematic. And I missed the first slides you showed, Frederick, but maybe you can tell me 2-3 things that is so unique about this idea and different from what in the development world we have been talking about all the time, about community-based approaches, participatory evaluations, inclusion of beneficiaries, all of these, local partnership, local leadership. So what are the 2-3 points that will make this approach different and leads to systemic change?
Thank you, Hadil. Thank you very much. I'll come to that. Anything further? Kathy, you've been part of this process, yeah, from the outset, and you know, and the organization that you are part of, the Poverty Stoplight, is very much an example of client-driven evaluation. You know, perhaps you could have a first answer to Hadil's question, right? Is this any different than these principles that have actually been around for a very long time in international development work?
Yeah, so as Frederick said, I'm working with the Poverty Stoplight program, which is basically trying to help people self-assess and to use that assessment that people provide to then inform further programming, but also to kind of help people to be the first ones to actually use that information. So I think it depends absolutely on how the idea is in fact implemented in the field. Like I do agree that it's built on a long history of like thought, let's say, in the development field. Like obviously the idea that there should be participation is not new. But from what we've learned about participatory processes is that very often they're not as participatory as one would like for them to be. So participatory programming often means that an organization comes into a community with already an idea for a program, then there's some form of consultation with people, basically on an idea that's already established. And kind of that feedback is, I don't know, taken into account or not, but like not really from kind of, the participation doesn't work from the beginning, and it certainly doesn't work in a way that really shifts the way that programs are done. So I like in my view, the way that this this approach or this proposal is different is that it's not trying to kind of plug the label participatory on a program that's already existing, but to really think about how we can truly build these ideas into the very kind of inner structures of the way that programs are done and that development is done. While that's certainly something that people have been striving towards for a long time, I don't think it's something that is actually being done in the development field, at least not in at the scale that we were looking for. And only I think if it's done that way, then we can really talk about or hope to see changing power structures. If it's not just like, yes, we'll get your opinion on what you're doing, but we find a way to really take serious what people bring to the table and to help people get something out of it.
Thank you so much, Kathy. And anyone else? Again, Shauna, you have been part of this for a long time, and this is something that I know is dear to you, but it is a fundamental question that Hadil is asking. These debates have been around for a long time. Why do we need yet another debate, another set of proposals around this?
I don't think we do. I think we should just be doing it, to be honest. Yeah. I think social enterprises are really, really well placed to bridge the gaps and the barriers between the siloed approach from governments and funders. And yeah, I just think we need to do it and report it and showcase it and have it out there. So many of us are doing it. We're just not doing it together. And I think that's the strength of Catalyst. if we can take what we're already doing, all of us who work this way, and there are many of us who work this way, and take that proof of that power shift that is happening, that can happen, but do it collectively with a much louder and bigger voice, I think it will automatically shift things. Where I'm stuck is I still don't see how this talks to what Arthur's talking about. I don't see the synergy there. But and maybe that will evolve. So for me, it's really about recognizing within the group of social entrepreneurs globally who works like this, bringing our work together in some way that's really tangible and actioning it immediately as fast as possible. Even if it's just joining the dots, it doesn't mean deep dive partnerships. It just means what part of what we collect can be collected in the same way, and how much of what we're doing, people are doing themselves, can be collected and turned into a movement that can be reported on and can really demonstrate that this does work.
To me, it would be very helpful if we could actually articulate a bit more clearly, indeed, what it is that we think is different here, if there is a difference. And I'd love to hear your views on this, because you have Zenda, because you have an overarching view on a lot that's of the tools and methodologies that exist in this sector. But if I just highlight a couple of points, one is really the ability for clients to initiate the process at any time. And I think technology now makes that far more accessible than could ever have been possible before. And the second is to Arthur's point, is that it's really putting the community and client at the center in the true sense that they're able to give a sense of what is happening in any shape or form around them, so that it's not being done Oxfam one day, Save the Children the other, Ministry of Health on the third day, etc. All of them do their own data collection, but it's not really being driven, so there isn't the overarching view of everything, right, being produced from below. And to my knowledge, this is something that is sorely missing. Zenda.
Just to say that, just exactly as you said now, Frederick, I think these are advantages if one can make it work well. And I want to agree with Shauna that I think what one needs to do is start to demonstrate how such collective action and client-driven in a real sense, because I agree there's a lot of misuse of the term, how that can really work very well, given the issues of power that Nabil refers to. So if you can develop an initiative that really addresses these ongoing problems that one has in development type work, I think that would be, and demonstrated through proper tracking and evaluation, I think that would be excellent. And there are ways to do it. I mean, you all of you have dealt with a lot of these. There are frameworks and systems and ways of collecting data that can really work well. What for me is a much bigger issue, and some of you have alluded to that, and it relates to what Arthur has said, is we constantly have to fight against systems that work differently to what we want to do. And it's political systems, and I mean political like, those who have the power in how development funding works, and also even in the investment sector, the financial investors and innovative finance sectors have very particular ways of working and what they like to see and where they want to put funding that really does not gel with this. So one needs to find some early adopters and make a platform of financiers that will go for something like this, and then really just demonstrate it with very good monitoring evaluation that can draw from good practice in many different ways. So I'm not really adding any value to what you've just said. I think it's just a matter of trying to demonstrate how this could possibly work.
Well, actually, Zinda, it leads perfectly to the next topic of conversation. So if we could break up now for another 10 minutes, please, and if Yvonne, you can help us, but
Yeah.
really to talk, so what we agreed in a sense in our last meeting was that we would not put a lot of emphasis into advocacy. Yes, Yvonne, we are putting this in a document and it's going to be going to the UN, but as a working group, what we are going to put our emphasis on is on the doing. Right? Now, I would be very helpful then to get your thoughts on what you recommend. What shall we do as next step? What is needed both in order to do this well and to propagate this and to communicate this, right? So that we lead simply by example.
Should I mix up the groups or?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
That would be great. Thank you so much, Yvonne.
Yeah.
Welcome back. Yeah, did you produce any concrete suggestions for next steps? Yeah, I know Selina can share from our group, I hope, but from the others, are there any concrete next steps that you recommend?
I think we have one.
Hey.
I can go.
Yes, please.
Well, I was in a group with Shauna and Walid, and we started off talking in that same vein of the disconnect between the scalability issues of small groups doing small projects versus, and then chasing small dollars, versus the real money is in large donors and large groups, kind of what Arthur was talking about, it in the $100 million, $500 million range. And they can't possibly donate to all the small groups that are doing the good work. And that Shauna suggested that really what we need is for Catalyst to form a co-op and then handle all that giant infrastructure and pull in those giant dollars. And then all the collection of small projects and service providers can use the same set of technology, the same set of tools, the same evaluation platform and reporting platforms. And there could be a support. Number two there's a document that talks about collaborating with academics to do data, and the academics are better at that than these small providers are, and that you can pull in these economies of scale while preserving this model of close to the ground, client-centered projects that are best accomplished by organizations that are small. Anyway, that was the Catalyst Co-op was our idea.
And we'll send Arthur out into the world to raise the funding. It sounds good to me. Yeah. We'll let you speak in a moment, Arthur. Because we're expecting your solution to this. Any other thoughts on next steps? Well, then over to you, Arthur.
Can I say I agree completely with 90% of what I have heard. As Halil said, this is about power and it's about incentives. And to Shona's question, how do we ensure that the community is at the center of this process? And to, sorry, Tab, my eyesight's going. How do you actually create a mechanism that allows you to do that? We often talk about collaboration, but the reality in our marketplace is that there's only really one large-scale collaborative mechanism. It's the foundation mechanism. And to a banker, a foundation is a closed-end investment trust that gives the capital away at minus 100% for a tax break. A tremendously inefficient capital market tool, but that's, we understand, is applicable to all our issues. we worked with a range of former regulators. It includes the former head of the exempt unit of the IRS for 10 years and a number of other leading lawyers, former US banking regulator. And we have been working on a legal framework based on LLC, LLP structures, which allows you to create a framework where different players take different or indeed differing economic social return, but with the social mission hardwired. It creates a framework that creates inter, between the silos, intra, between for-profits, not-for-profits, governments, and between countries, a legal framework that allows you to create that inter, intra, and cross-sectoral collaboration. It is looked through for tax purposes. That means each entity continues to be taxed according to its own framework, but it allows you to create a single integrated partnership framework focused on a social issue or a community. That, in my mind, is one of the key, along with metrics, is absolutely one of the key elements. It is also a structure that integrates subsidy and integrates into the relevant tax systems. So it's based on a series of global law that's been passed ever since 1979. And what Mark Owens, the former head of the exempt unit of the IRS, did was to integrate a social element into that. It also allows you to create cross-subsidization structures between the various players and allows each player to take a different or indeed differing economic return. So that's the first, and it gets to your point, Tab, in terms of actually having a legal framework that allows you to do that. The second building block, somebody mentioned externalities. Well, externalities is where the real value of what we do is. If you put $1 into education in India, it generates $50 of future economic value. You put $1 into TB, it generates $45 of economic value. You do it quicker, it's $85. If you look at the work of Guy Hutton, in what somebody mentioned, water and sanitation, the value of those externalities is $500 billion a year in reality. What do we do on our side? Well, we create systems and processes and solutions in our silos. If we actually aggregated together in partnership structures, then actually there is a mechanism where the combined collaboration of those players will allow it to be reflected in a security that then trades as a function of the achievement of the social metric. So the quicker you achieve the social metric, the higher the return, of which the community and the stakeholders and the social entrepreneurs are owners in that process. And what that means is that what you do not end up doing is putting subsidy into about 4 or 5 issues, which is what is happening at the moment. There's not enough subsidy to solve the problem. What becomes the most interesting market, if you pay by the rate at which you are solving that issue, critical point. So it's not about funding the element, it's about the rate at which you solve it. It means that the issues that you will want to address are the issues where there is the highest level of social deprivation, because that is where you can create the greatest impact. Now, once you create a mechanism where there is the granular value of each of the social entrepreneurs in a complex system, and that innovation can be replicated and you get paid for it, or your innovation can be taken and applied to a different issue and you get paid for it. And at the same time, you are saving money to people to not have to build the value chain themselves. So Frederick, you'll give me the figure, Frederick, you spent $20 million in various grants building a feedback loop that's now done, what, 3,000 clients, whatever, and $1 billion. Now, sure, people can go away and build up themselves, but why do that? Why not take what Frederick's done, white label it, plug and play it into what you need? And it's the same of all your innovations. It's exactly the same. What we try to do is for everybody to build everything ourselves. And we get proud, you know, let me give an example, which I pick on because they're large.
But you have to tie it up now.
Very quick. Red Cross, to give you an example, spent 5 years developing a humanitarian bond for about $30 million. And they go on the circuits and they talk about it. How different would that conversation have been if the Red Cross as a unitary whole had gone to the banking sector and said, hello, we employ globally 435,000 people and we have a turnover of $36 billion. That's really quite a shocking statistic when you think about it. The reason we do not get bankers' attention is, and the reason we're stuck in venture capital models is because we all try to do these individual elements. And they're great and they're wonderful. But if you actually put them together, give them a value and give them a value as a function of how quickly you solve those problems, then you have something for bankers to trade. And you price the externalities. The externalities and our failure to price them is the fundamental flaw of capitalism. It means the market.
Arthur, thank you. Thank you so much. We have our vision, basically. It seems, Tab, yeah, we're trying to make good on your idea here. But so what does this mean in the last minutes that we have as a group here? What are we going to do as concrete next steps that lay some of the infrastructure that could get us there? Shauna, what's the next step?
What do you think will, besides submitting our proposal, which I think we'll need to puff up it a little bit more, I think really getting commitment from a number of people who share a common way of practice would to actually become part of setting it all up, to take the leap of faith and work together.
Yeah.
For me, that's the next step, because we're all working along in our own routes, and until we actually say, okay, I agree to these values and I agree to take a risk, and let's try and work together and try and achieve this, at least the first steps of this.
Thanks. Kathy, did you want to say something? No? Selina, yeah, what do you see as a next step that would be useful to you in your work?
Moving back to trying to create a prototype example of working together and proving the impact and the success so that we can show it.
Walid, is there anything that comes to your mind that would resonate and work in Tunisia?
Yeah, as I already shared with you, yeah, we need more to put it in practice right now in Tunisia. We have some opportunities right now to get further with the centric approach. So yeah, absolutely.
And Hadil, this is I think your first meeting in Catalyst 2030, so we're not asking you to sign on the dotted line right away. But does this have any resonance for you?
So definitely having a community-led, people-centered, I don't want to use client-centered, but people-centered approaches is in the heart of the work I do and I believe in, definitely, all my life. I had a good conversation with Arthur, and I don't think it's I don't think I am convinced of the uniqueness of the approach yet. So I need to be talked more into it and convinced about what does it mean and how is it different from other phrases that we are using. For example, in Oxfam, we use a feminist meal monitoring and evaluation approach. Feminist meal is a big thing for us. And basically it shifts the power in terms of evaluation and learning to the peoples, to the people who are most concerned. So for me, in my thinking, I don't know the difference. I need to reflect more on that, but definitely I believe in people-centered approaches, and I think there is a lot to be done in partnerships, which also can happen at different dimensions. So not only at the level of international NGOs or between big actors like the UN or the financial institutions, but also at the community level. So there is a huge space for local community groups to come together and work together and share the learning. Again, there was a little bit of discussion or mention of social enterprises. So something that I am recently more interested in. I didn't really grasp the approach. What does it mean, and what does social enterprise mean to you or the people who mentioned it? So this is something probably I will get to learn more about in the coming meetings if possible, because yes, definitely there is an opportunity there, but how are we going to manage it, and would social enterprises amongst themselves be a starting point? That's another thing for me, but it's more questions than answers for a first meeting for sure.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate you all taking part in this call, in this webinar. We have just passed the half hour, and yeah, we didn't have quite as many people on the call as hoped and as had registered, but it was definitely a quality discussion. And so again, thank you so much, all of you. What we are going to do is absolutely be looking at those concrete next steps and creating what we refer to in a previous call as utilities, right? So that we can really share these examples far more widely. But before we share, we have to demonstrate and prove that. Thank you so much, all of you, again, and have a lovely evening, morning, wherever you are. All the very best. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Tab, we could have a conversation now, even. How are you?
We could.